Jerusalem, around AD 33. The air is cold before sunrise. Smoke from cooking fires and burned brush clings to the stone alleys. Sand grinds under leather sandals. Somewhere below the Temple Mount, a woman wakes up in a city that has just watched the impossible happen. Her son was executed by Rome, buried, then seen alive, then taken into heaven before the eyes of his followers. And now the question no one in stained glass ever answers is this: what happened to Mary after that? Not the Christmas card Mary, not the polished marble statue, not the silent woman floating in blue robes through church art. I'm talking about the real first-century Mary, a Jewish mother in a conquered land, a woman who had smelled blood, sweat, smoke, and grief, a woman who had outlived prophecy, scandal, exile, and crucifixion. And after Jesus ascended, her story does not end with cinematic music and a fade to white. It disappears into silence. So today, I want to take you into that silence. And as we do, tell me in the comments where you think Mary spent her final years: Jerusalem or Ephesus? If you love deep biblical history without the Hollywood polish, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me to the end, because the final mystery of Mary may say more about your faith than you expect. Let's begin with the hard truth. The New Testament gives us only one final, clear glimpse of Mary after the Ascension. In Acts 1:14, she is in Jerusalem, in the upper room, praying with the apostles and the other believers. Before that, in John 19, Jesus, from the cross, entrusts her to the beloved disciple, traditionally identified as John. That is the last firm ground under our feet. After that, Scripture goes quiet. And that silence matters. Because in a culture obsessed with visible greatness, the mother of Jesus vanishes from the biblical record not in triumphal spectacle, but in prayer. No public throne, no final speech, no recorded miracle. Just a woman among believers, waiting for the promise of God. Try to imagine that room. Low ceiling, plastered walls, rough lamps, dust in the corners. Bodies pressed close in anxious faith. The city outside still dangerous, priests still hostile, Rome still armed. And there, among fishermen, former tax collectors, Jesus' brothers, and frightened disciples, is Mary. Not as decoration, not as myth, as witness. We romanticize Jerusalem. We think sacred light, choral music, clean robes. But first-century Jerusalem was crowded, noisy, political, and tense. Stone houses held heat in the day and bled it back out at night. Water had to be carried. Bread had to be ground. Oil lamps smoked. Animals were close. Refuse was real. Fear was not abstract. It was administrative, military, and immediate. Mary lived in that world. By this point, she was no longer the young girl of Nazareth receiving Gabriel's message. She was a mother who had carried memory for decades. The manger, the flight into Egypt, the years of obscurity, the wedding at Cana, the growing hostility around Jesus, the cross, the sealed tomb, and then the unbearable shock of resurrection. And now what? What does a mother do after the son she raised returns to the Father? She keeps living. That may be the most human part of the story. After the earthquake moments of redemption history, somebody still has to wake up, knead bread, mend cloth, draw water, whisper prayers, and endure another day in a body that remembers sorrow. Mary's final chapter, whatever else it was lived in that kind of realism. Historically, Jerusalem is the strongest early candidate. Why? Because Mary's last biblical appearance is there. John is part of the Jerusalem leadership in the early church, and later Christian memory in the Holy Land became deeply attached to Jerusalem sites associated with her final days. A long-standing tradition locates Mary's tomb in the Kidron Valley near the Mount of Olives, and the church now standing there preserves remains of a 5th-century structure built around a tomb Christians venerated as hers. Scholarly work on early Dormition traditions also argues that the Jerusalem house tradition has the stronger claim to priority over competing locations. That does not prove the case beyond all doubt, but it matters. Because if Mary remained in Jerusalem, then her last years were not spent in picturesque retirement. They were spent in the city where Jesus had been rejected, condemned, and crucified. The same hills, the same temple courts, the same roads where Roman power and religious rage had collided with divine mercy. Imagine Mary walking those streets. Every corner would remember something: a gate, a stairway, a market shout, the smell of Passover lamb, the direction of Golgotha, the path toward the garden tomb, the slope of the Mount of Olives where he was taken from their sight. Jerusalem would not have been merely a holy city to her. It would have been a city full of wounds. Then there is the Ephesus tradition. This idea usually comes from one powerful line in the Gospel: Jesus gave Mary into the care of the beloved disciple. Later Christian traditions strongly linked John with Ephesus, and over time, many concluded that Mary must have gone with him. Ephesus also became enormously important in Marian devotion, especially because the church council held there in 431 defended the title Theotokos, God-bearer, affirming that Mary truly was the mother of the incarnate Son of God. But here is the myth-busting truth. The historical evidence for Mary actually ending her life in Ephesus is much thinner than many people assume. A major scholarly study notes that the earliest evidence for that belief appears only in the late 9th century and calls the pre-modern evidence for the Ephesus tradition meager. So yes, Ephesus is possible in the broad sense of later tradition. But no, we cannot speak of it as though the New Testament says it plainly. It doesn't. And that is where many popular videos go wrong. They flatten devotion into history. They turn possibility into certainty. They give you confidence where the sources give you mystery. The honest answer is harder, but holier. We do not know with certainty where Mary spent her final earthly days. Jerusalem has the earlier historical weight. Ephesus has later devotional power. And between them stands silence. Now we come to the deepest mystery. Christians across centuries did not want Mary's story simply to end in obscurity, because the one who bore the incarnate Christ could not be thought of as spiritually insignificant. Over time, ancient traditions developed around her final departure, what Eastern Christians call the Dormition, the falling asleep of Mary. Scholarly evidence shows these traditions were in circulation by around AD 450 and emerged prominently in Orthodox Christian discourse in the late 5th century. The stories vary in details, but many describe Mary's peaceful death, the gathering of apostles, burial, and her being taken by God into glory. But again, we need honesty. The New Testament does not mention the Assumption. Later Catholic doctrine does affirm that Mary, after completing her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. Yet even that dogmatic definition deliberately does not settle as a matter of faith whether she died first. Eastern Christianity usually emphasizes her death before glorification. Catholic teaching leaves that specific point open at the dogmatic level. That means the final earthly hours of Mary are hidden behind the veil of tradition, liturgy, theology, and reverent memory, which, for modern people like us, is frustrating. We want surveillance camera certainty. We want timestamps. We want a map pin. God gave us a mother in prayer, a church in memory, and a mystery at the end. And maybe That is exactly the point. Think about how God writes Mary's final chapter. Not with political power, not with public applause, not with a carefully documented biography. The woman who carried the Word made flesh into the world is left, in her final biblical appearance, doing something shockingly ordinary. Waiting with the church. Praying. Trusting. Remaining. That is not accidental, because most believers do not live on Mount Carmel in moments of fire from heaven. We live in upper rooms, in grief, in unanswered questions, in ordinary routines after extraordinary pain. Mary knew what it meant to receive a promise she could not control. She knew what it meant to carry Christ when nobody around her fully understood. She knew what it meant to watch the world misunderstand him. She knew what it meant to stand near a cross and not turn away. And after he rose and ascended, she knew what it meant to keep living in the long silence between glory revealed and glory completed. That is where many of us are right now. Jesus is risen. The promise is true. But the room is still cramped. The empire is still loud. The grief is still fresh. The future is still hidden. And Mary's final mystery speaks directly into that condition. Because her life says this: you do not have to understand every hidden chapter for God to be faithful in it. The Bible's silence about Mary's final days is not a failure of revelation. It may be a mercy. It turns our eyes away from curiosity as entertainment and back toward discipleship as endurance. It reminds us that holiness is not always dramatic. Sometimes holiness is staying. Sometimes holiness is praying when heaven feels quiet. Sometimes holiness is carrying old sorrow without letting it harden into unbelief. Sometimes holiness is living the rest of your life in the shadow of a promise that is true, even when it is not yet complete. Mary's greatness was never that she controlled the story. Her greatness was that she consented to God, endured with God, and trusted God when the road vanished into mystery. So what is the truth about Mary's last days? Historically, the truth is this: we know less than legend claims. Biblically, the truth is this: Mary's last clear appearance is in prayer, in the fellowship of believers after the Ascension. Spiritually, the truth is this: her final chapter is one of the most important lessons in the Christian life. The mother who once held the infant Christ had to live, at the end, by faith in the exalted Christ. She had to trust the same Lord she once fed with her own hands. She had to wait for the full redemption of a world that had pierced her heart and yet been redeemed by her Son. And if that was her path, why would ours be any different? So here's the question I want to leave with you. What part of your life, right now, feels like Mary's hidden years, silent, unresolved, and unseen? And do you still trust Christ there? Tell me in the comments. Because maybe the greatest mystery of Mary's final days is not where she died. Maybe it is this: can you remain faithful when God gives you promise, but not full explanation?